Three men kicked in the door of Earl Dawson's diner and started trashing the place, breaking chairs, smashing the counter glass, throwing an old man's life's work onto the floor. They grabbed his waitress and slammed her into the wall. The old man behind the counter just stood there, 67 years old, gray hair, hands that hadn't been in a fight in 40 years. He had one choice in that moment: stand down and let them wreck everything he'd built, or do something he swore he'd never do again. What those three men didn't know was who they'd just walked in on. 40 years ago, men twice their size used to go quiet when Earl Dawson's name came up. Nobody in this diner that morning had any idea what was about to happen, or why a kid named Curtis Lane should never have sent his crew through that door. Stick around. This one gets a lot more dangerous before it's done. It started 30 seconds earlier than that. The door hadn't even finished swinging when the first one, a thick-necked guy with a shaved head, put his boot through a chair just to announce they'd arrived. The second one walked straight down the counter, knocking over the ketchup bottles, the napkin holders, the little vase with the plastic flower Sarah had put there herself. Pure noise. Pure mess. The kind of thing that's not about damage. It's about making sure everyone in the room understands who's in charge for the next few minutes. The third one was the one who grabbed Sarah. He didn't ask her to move. He just took her arm and threw her, and she hit the edge of the counter hard enough that her knees went out from under her. That's when Earl set the spatula down. He came around the end of the counter the way he did everything. Slow, unhurried, like a man who had all the time in the world. The shaved-head one saw him coming and laughed. An old man in an apron, walking toward three of them, like he had any business doing that. He stopped laughing about 4 seconds later. Earl gave him a chance first, stood there a half-second longer than he needed to, and said one thing quiet. "Walk out now, and we forget this happened." The kid swung instead. Earl let the punch come to him, watched the fist travel, and at the last possible second tilted his head 3 inches to the left. The punch went past his ear into nothing. Before that kid even understood he'd missed, Earl's hand was already closing around the back of his neck. One motion. The kid's face met the edge of a table, and he didn't get back up. The other two stopped moving. For 1 full second, the only sound in that diner was a coffee pot still hissing on the burner. Then the second one picked up a chair, because somebody had to do something, and Earl Dawson, 67 years old, shifted his weight the way a man does, right before he stops waiting. That's the part everybody wants to skip straight to. So let's slow down for 1 second, because you need to understand exactly who that old man used to be before you watch what he does to the rest of them. Earl Dawson had opened that diner at 5 o'clock every morning for 19 years running. Same time, every single day. By the time the first trucker walked through the door, the place already smelled like bacon grease and coffee strong enough to strip paint. In a town like Millbrook, Ohio, that smell was about the closest thing to church most men ever got. Big he was. Not Jim Big. The kind of big that comes from 40 years of hard living, settling into a man's bones and never quite leaving. Gray hair cut short, beard trimmed close. Quiet mostly, but when Earl Dawson talked, people leaned in. Sarah Mills had walked into that diner 8 months earlier looking for work. Earl hadn't asked her many questions. 24 years old, sharp, the type who'd learned, the hard way, not to trust people too fast. He gave her an apron, a key to the back door, and not once in 8 months did he raise his voice at her. Millbrook had been a quiet town for a long time. Then, about 6 months before that morning, the quiet started cracking at the edges. A new outfit moved in. Called themselves the Black Vipers. Young. Mean in the particular way young men get mean when they've found a shortcut to feeling powerful. Their operation wasn't complicated. Walk into a small business, explain that the neighborhood had gotten dangerous, and offer protection for a modest weekly fee. The hardware store paid first. The laundromat went next. The tire shop held out almost a month until a brick went through their window. Within a season, every business on that stretch of road was leaving an envelope on a counter every Friday. Nobody fought it. Fighting it got your windows broken. Or worse. Their leader called himself Curtis Lane, 27 years old. Tattoos climbing both sides of his neck. a smile that never once made it as far as his eyes. He'd built the whole operation up from nothing and was visibly proud of it. People who'd known him longer said he'd grown up watching his father get pushed around by every landlord in 3 counties, never once pushing back. And Curtis had decided early on that nobody would ever look at him that way. He'd built fear instead of respect, because fear was faster. 3 days before that morning, Curtis Lane came through Earl's front door for the first time, 2 of his guys trailing behind. They sat at the counter, spun the stools, put their boots up, where the coffee cups belonged. Curtis looked around, the old photographs, the regulars gone quiet, and then he looked at Earl and smiled. He told Earl the neighborhood had gotten dangerous. Said for $200 a week, he'd personally make sure nothing happened to such a nice old place. Earl poured 3 cups of coffee, slid them across the counter, didn't charge a cent. Then he said exactly 1 word. No. The whole diner went still. Curtis's smile flickered like a candle catching a draft it didn't see coming. He wasn't used to that word. Most men telling Curtis Lane no said it with their voice shaking. Earl's didn't shake at all. Curtis laughed it off. Said he'd swing back by in a few days. Then he and his boys walked out, and the whole diner let out a breath it had been holding. Sarah came over once they'd gone, scared and not hiding it. Told Earl maybe they should just pay. $200 wasn't worth somebody getting hurt over. Earl wiped down the counter and told her not to worry. Said men like that talked a lot bigger than they hit. He believed that, mostly. But Earl Dawson also understood, with a clarity that scared even him a little, exactly what kind of storm was rolling in. He let Sarah keep believing it would blow over, because that's the small mercy you offer somebody who's already carrying enough fear for 1 lifetime. What he didn't tell her was that he'd made his decision the moment Curtis Lane walked back out that door. He just hoped it wouldn't actually come to that. It came to that. Above the register hung a single photograph, a much younger Earl, standing next to a row of motorcycles with men whose names nobody in town had ever heard him say. Sarah had asked about it once. He'd told her those were men he used to know. Brothers, in the way that word means something different once you've bled next to somebody. I miss who I was around them, he'd said, not what we did. Respect built on fear always collects its bill eventually with interest. She hadn't fully understood what he meant, not then. She would before that week was out. 3 quiet days passed. Earl almost let himself believe Curtis had moved on. Then that morning arrived. The boot through the glass, the chairs, Sarah hitting the floor. Curtis hadn't come himself. Too smart for that. He'd sent 3 of his crew instead, the ones who liked the work a little too much. And they'd come in Loud, because Loud had worked on every other business on that strip. They had no idea they'd just walked into the one place where Loud wasn't going to be enough. The one with the chair swung first, a wide overhead arc built to put Earl on the ground. Earl stepped inside the swing instead, close enough that the chair came down across his back instead of his skull. While the man was still finishing a swing that had already failed, Earl drove a fist up under his ribs, and the chair clattered off fingers that had forgotten how to hold anything. The last one threw a punch built entirely out of panic. Earl leaned away, caught him by the collar, and walked him straight through what remained of the front door. The glass that hadn't already come down came down then. 9 seconds. Maybe 10. 3 grown men on the floor or on the sidewalk, and 1 old man in a flour-dusted apron who wasn't even breathing hard. Someone laughed. The nervous kind, the kind that escapes a body the second it believes it's safe again. Earl helped Sarah up first, checked the cut above her elbow. Then he looked down at the 3 of them and told them, quiet, to crawl back to Curtis Lane and let him know the diner wasn't paying. Not this week, not ever. They went. Limping, none of them looking back once. Earl swept the glass himself, told the regulars breakfast was on the house. Sat Sarah at the counter, poured her a coffee she hadn't asked for. The room filled back up with low talk, everybody already turning 9 seconds of violence into a story they'd tell for years. Earl finally poured himself a coffee, sat down, rolled a shoulder that still carried an old ache, and let out a breath that had clearly been waiting its turn. He looked exactly like what he was supposed to be most days, a tired man who'd handled a little trouble and was ready to put it behind him. Sarah asked him, low, where a man learns to move like that. Earl smiled, just barely, and said it was a long time ago. Said it didn't matter anymore. He believed every word of that when he said it. He was wrong. The worst of that morning hadn't even introduced itself yet. The phone behind the counter rang. Earl let it go twice before picking it up. Listened, said nothing, and whatever easy look had been resting on his face packed up and left for good. A voice on the other end said his full name, Earl Dawson. Then it said something that made him set his coffee cup down slower than he'd set anything down in years. We know who you are now. Here's what had happened in the 20 minutes since those 3 men limped out. They'd made it back to Curtis Lane, and Curtis had been furious. Somewhere in the middle of that fury, one of the older guys on the crew, a man who'd ridden with Ruffer Company long before Curtis was old enough to shave, heard the description of the diner and went the color of old paper. Because that older man remembered a name from a long way back. Back when the real clubs ran those highways. Back when the wrong patch on a man's back could clear out a bar in under 10 seconds. There had been exactly one name people said quiet, like saying it too loud might summon him. Dawson. And just like that, the whole shape of the morning changed. This stopped being about $200 a week. The instant that crew understood who Earl Dawson actually was, the job turned into something a great deal colder. A name like that, alive and breathing where half the town could watch him drop 3 of their men, wasn't a problem they could leave standing. If word got out the Black Vipers got humiliated by one old man and did nothing about it, the whole operation was finished by Friday. So it stopped being a shakedown. It became a cleanup. The voice told Earl they were coming back. All of them this time. Told him there'd be no witnesses left standing to talk about it afterward. Then it hung up. Earl stood there holding a dead phone, and for the first time all morning, he understood exactly how much time he had left, and exactly how little that was. He didn't panic. 40 years seemed to melt off him in roughly 3 seconds flat, and what stood underneath was the man he'd spent 2 decades trying to bury under aprons and quiet Tuesday mornings. He told the regulars, in a voice that left zero room for arguing, to go out the back right now and not come back today. They went without a word. Then there was Sarah. He told her to go too. Take the truck, drive to her cousin's place 2 towns over. She didn't move an inch. She stood right there in the wreckage and told him she wasn't leaving him alone with whatever was coming. Earl didn't argue with her. He walked into the back office instead and came out holding a small steel box. Set it on the counter, opened it, took out a single object, a patch, old leather edges gone soft and frayed. The kind you earn and bleed for, and that men have died over before they ever got the chance to wear it. He didn't explain what it meant. Didn't need to. Sarah had grown up in this part of the country, and she knew exactly what she was looking at. All at once, she understood that the quiet man who'd handed her a job had once stood near the very top of a world she'd only ever heard about in whispers. He told her gently that he needed her gone, not out of fear for himself, but because he didn't want her watching him become that man again. He'd spent 40 years walking away from him, and he didn't want that to be the last picture of him she carried around. Sarah took the keys. She didn't drive 2 towns over. She made it as far as the gas station across the road, parked under the awning, and sat there shaking, because some part of her couldn't make the rest of her leave him completely. Earl locked the back door, righted the broken chairs, and reached under the counter to a spot he'd checked every single morning for 19 years and never once needed. And he waited. Out on the road, you could already hear them coming. A line of engines, low at first, then climbing, the sound of a great many men arriving at once with no plan to leave anybody behind who could talk about it later. Earl stood behind his counter, hands flat against the wood, in the exact spot he'd stood 3 days earlier. 67 years old. About to be outnumbered, better than 10 to 1, and still, by a wide margin, the most dangerous thing within 500 miles of that diner. The first engine cut out right outside the door. They came in slower than the first crew had, and that told Earl everything he needed to know. This crew came in careful, spreading along the walls the second they cleared the doorway. They knew now, and men who know exactly what they're walking into, and walk in anyway, are a different breed of dangerous. Curtis Lane came in last. He stepped over the broken glass and looked at Earl. The soft smile was gone, replaced by something tighter. 11 of them, in the end. More than half carrying something. A bat, a length of chain, one carrying something heavier in his waistband he hadn't pulled out yet, and one old man behind a counter in a flour-dusted apron. Curtis tried talking first, told Earl he hadn't known who he was dealing with, said maybe they could still work something out. But even as the words left his mouth, his crew kept moving, fanning out along the walls, boxing the room in from 3 directions. Earl watched the spread and understood every word out of Curtis's mouth was nothing but noise meant to cover it. So Earl didn't answer the words, he answered the spread. The man easing toward his right flank with a length of chain was the real threat, and Earl knew it before the man finished deciding to move. Earl came over the top of his own counter faster than any of them believed a man his age could move, and he was on the chain before it finished rising. One short, brutal strike to the throat, and that man folded straight to the floor, gasping. The room exploded. The first fight had been fast. 9 seconds, gone almost before it started. This one wasn't fast. This one was a war. 11 men couldn't all reach him at once in a room that narrow, and that single fact was the only thing keeping Earl alive. He put his back to the counter, so they could only come at him from the front, and made every single one of them pay full price. A bat came down across his shoulder instead of his skull, and his whole arm went half numb, and he kept moving anyway. His body told him he wasn't the man he'd been at 30, with every joint screaming a little louder than the last. But 40 years hadn't taken the one thing that had always mattered most about Earl Dawson. In a fight, the man simply did not stop. He broke a man's forearm with that same length of chain, drove another headfirst into the pastry case, caught a wrist with a knife in it, turned it the wrong direction, and watched the blade hit the tile. Then a length of pipe caught him flush across the back of the skull. He hadn't seen that one coming, not fully, and for one long, terrible second, the whole diner tilted sideways in front of his eyes. His knees buckled. Somewhere behind the gas station glass, Sarah's hand went flat against her own mouth, and she stopped breathing entirely. For that 1 second, every man left standing believed they were about to watch Earl Dawson go down for good, and so did Earl. He didn't go down. He found the edge of the counter with his palm, pulled himself back upright through sheer ugly will, and put down the man who'd swung that pipe with a single elbow that ended the question entirely. But he was bleeding badly now, and slowing, and there were still 6 of them standing. That was when Curtis Lane, who'd been hanging back near the door, finally reached for the thing tucked into his waistband. The gun came out, and every sound in that diner stopped at once. A gun changes a fight. Doesn't matter how skilled a man is, how big, how willing. Earl stood there against his own counter, blood running down his chin, and looked straight down the barrel held by a scared 27-year-old who'd never once crossed that particular line before. Curtis's hand shook, badly. He'd built an entire operation on noise and fear, and he'd never had to actually pull a trigger on a living man. Now here he stood, facing the single most dangerous person he was ever going to meet, and the gun felt a great deal heavier than it had 10 seconds earlier. Earl spoke, quiet. The same exact quiet he'd used 3 days earlier, the day one word had changed everything. He told Curtis that if he meant to pull that trigger, he'd better not miss. Because the second that bullet failed to put him down, Earl was going to take that gun out of his hand and use it. And there would be no more talking after that. Not for Curtis. Not for any of the 6 men still on their feet. And that was the moment the front door opened again. Sarah walked in. She'd had a clean, easy path to staying exactly where she was, safe out of it entirely. She got out of the truck anyway, crossed the road, and walked straight into a room full of armed men. She didn't say much at first. She held Earl's old patch up high, where everyone could see it, and said one thing, loud, to the whole room. Told them they all knew exactly what that patch meant. Told them the man whose name belonged on the wall of that world was standing right there, bleeding, and that the people who'd given him that patch were still out there somewhere, and they did not forget their own. It was a bluff, and it wasn't a bluff. Every man in that diner had grown up on stories about exactly that kind of loyalty, and not one of them could say with any certainty that she was wrong. You could watch it land in real time. 6 hard, dangerous men, running the same math, and the math kept coming out wrong for every one of them. The gun came down first. Curtis lowered it slow, like the weight of it had finally won an argument his arm had been losing. There are doors a man doesn't open. There are men a man simply walks past on the street and counts himself lucky for it afterward. Curtis Lane had kicked one of those doors clean off its hinges, over $200 a week, and it had cost him nearly everything in the space of one morning. Earl stepped forward and took the gun out of his hand. Curtis let him. It was over, truly over this time. The men who could still walk, walked. They left the diner the way people leave a funeral, quiet, careful, nobody looking back. By the time police finally arrived, called by half the regulars Earl had sent home, there was nothing left but broken glass, dark stains on the tile, and one old man sitting on a stool with a split lip and a bag of frozen peas pressed against his shoulder. Curtis Lane was arrested at the scene, along with 6 of his crew. The investigation turned up 6 months of extortion records, security footage, sworn accounts from half the businesses on that strip. The Black Vipers collapsed within the month. The hardware store stopped paying inside a week. The tire shop's owner walked down personally and told whoever was left running things that he was finished and got no argument back. Curtis went to prison, still owing real money to real people he'd never get the chance to pay back. He wrote Sarah a letter from there, about a year later. Earl never read it, but Sarah kept it folded in a drawer behind the register for the rest of her life. What she said, once, was that the letter hadn't asked her for anything. It had just said he was sorry, plainly, without trying to make it smaller than it was. That was the first time in her life. Anybody who'd hurt her had apologized, without also handing her a reason it wasn't really their fault. As for who Earl Dawson really used to be, the town mostly let it lie. A handful of the older folks had recognized the name the moment it surfaced, and they understood, in their own quiet way, why a man who'd once been what Earl Dawson had been might want to spend the second half of his life flipping eggs and pouring coffee, and never once raising his voice at another living soul. Sometimes the most dangerous people in the world want, more than almost anything else, to be left alone in peace. They've already seen exactly where the other road goes, and they know better than anyone alive that it doesn't lead anywhere good. Sarah stayed. She put the patch back into its steel box herself and handed it to Earl with both hands. Neither of them talked about that day much afterward, but something between them had shifted permanently, in a way that never required words to be real. She'd seen the man underneath the apron now, and what she felt afterward, instead of fear, was something closer to what a daughter feels for a father who's finally let her see the whole of him. She understood why he'd never once asked where she'd been running from. A man like Earl didn't need to ask a question like that. He'd spent a good part of his own life running from something too, and he'd finally found a place worth stopping in. The diner reopened 3 days after that morning. New glass in the door. The same faded photograph still hanging on the wall. The regulars came back and brought friends, and for a good long while that little roadside diner in Millbrook, Ohio, stayed busier than it had been in all 19 years combined. Earl never cared much for the fuss. He poured their coffee, waved off their thanks, and slowly the fuss wore itself down to something closer to normal. Life went back to being quiet, exactly the way Earl preferred it. Think back, for a second, to where this whole thing started. A boot through the glass. A young woman thrown to the floor. An old man setting down a coffee pot, slow and careful, like it mattered. It looked, in that very first moment, like a mismatch nobody could survive. It looked like the world doing exactly what the world does too often, the strong taking from the weak, the young rolling over the old. But that's the thing about quiet men the world keeps forgetting. The quiet isn't weakness. Sometimes the quiet is a choice made by somebody who's already been everywhere violence can take a person, and decided on purpose to come back from it and pour coffee instead. Curtis Lane looked at Earl Dawson that first morning and saw an easy mark. What he should have seen was a man who'd had set down a heavy burden a long time ago, and who would pick it back up exactly once, for exactly the right reason, and then set it down again for good. Earl Dawson ran that roadside diner for another 11 years after that morning. He passed away quietly in his sleep, in the small apartment above the diner where he'd lived the whole time. Half the town turned out for the funeral. Sarah, who, by then, had taken over running the place herself, kept his stool empty behind the counter for years afterward and never let a single person sit in it. And somewhere in a steel box in the back office, there's still an old leather patch, frayed at every edge, that nobody has ever needed to take back out again. Because by then, everyone who needed to know already knew exactly who Earl Dawson had been, and exactly who he'd chosen to become instead. 11 years passed, and Earl Dawson never raised his voice at another living soul. He flipped eggs. He poured coffee before the sky picked a color. He listened to Sarah talk about her day, and never once brought up Curtis Lane's name unless she brought it up first. The steel box went back in the office, and the patch went back in the box, and it sat there year after year, untouched, the way a fire extinguisher sits behind glass. Not forgotten, just no longer needed. Millbrook kept its quiet roadside diner. Earl kept his stool, his apron, and his mornings. That was the whole second half of his life, and he never once wanted it any other way. If you or someone you know is being threatened, intimidated, or extorted by a person or group demanding money for protection, you do not have to handle that alone. Contact local law enforcement, and if you want to report a pattern of organized extortion, the FBI accepts tips at Tips. FBI Gov, available anytime, day or night. You don't need to have all the answers. You only need to make the call. If this story stayed with you, if there was a moment, a detail, something you can't quite shake, tell me about it in the comments below. I read every single one, and I want to know, which part hit you hardest? If you're new here, welcome. Heart Tales is where stories like this live. Stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the quietest, most human ways possible. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And before you go, there are 2 more stories waiting for you right now on your screen. I think you'll want to stay. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring enough to make it to the end. That matters more than you know.